The great hall was a cavern of ice, not the pristine, glittering ice of a winter palace, but a jagged, violent frost that clawed its way up the stone pillars and across the tapestries. It radiated from the dais, from the fallen form of the king. King Theron lay sprawled on the steps of his own throne, his massive frame convulsing, a rime of white clinging to his black hair and beard. A low, guttural sound ripped from his chest, a sound that was not entirely human, not entirely wolf. It was the sound of a beast tearing itself apart from the inside. His royal guard, the formidable stone wolves, formed a perimeter, their own faces pale with a fear she had never seen on them. They held their silver-inlaid spears, but they were pointed inward, not at any external threat, but at their own king. The air crackled with a power that was both freezing and burning, a wild magic that had broken its leash. "The beast's behavior is an omen," Elder Maeve declared, her voice a thin, reedy thing against the monstrous groans of the king. She stood hunched near a pillar, her gnarled hands clutching a staff of petrified wood. Her eyes, milky with age, were fixed on the writhing king. Lord Commander Valerius, his face a grim mask, did not take his eyes off his sovereign. "An omen of what, Elder?" "Of the end," she whispered, and the words seemed to freeze in the air. "The blight has finally reached his heart. The beast fights to be free of the dying flesh. It will shatter him, and then it will shatter us all." A collective gasp, a shudder of terror, went through the assembled court. They shuffled back, their finery crunching on the thin layer of ice that now coated the marble floors. They saw only the monster on the throne. They saw only the omen of their own destruction. But Alara saw the man. She saw the tremor in his clenched fist, the line of agony etched between his brows. She saw the flicker of gold in his eyes, a light she knew, a light that was being swallowed by a fathomless, icy darkness. She pushed through the guards. A hand grabbed her arm. "Healer, no, it's not safe." She barely registered the words. Her focus was a tiny burning point in the center of the frozen chaos. Theron. He needed her. The thought was not rational. It was an instinct that screamed louder than the king's own roars. She reached the dais, the cold so intense it felt like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She fell to her knees beside him, her simple woolen dress instantly stiffening with frost. His skin was the color of slate, cold as a tombstone. His head thrashed, and for a moment, his eyes found hers. The wildness receded, just for a second. The ice-blue storm of the beast gave way to the molten gold of the man. A flicker of recognition, of pain, of a desperate, unspoken question. His lips, blue with cold, barely moved. He saw the elder's pronouncement of doom reflected in the terror of his court. But then he saw Alara, kneeling in the heart of his storm, her face filled not with fear, but with a fierce, defiant sorrow. The Alpha King, the beast of the north, looked past the omen, past the prophecy of his own end, and his gaze locked on the only thing that had ever felt like a beginning. His voice was a ghost of a sound, a rasp of cracking ice. He asked, "What kind?" Then his eyes rolled back, and the last flicker of gold was extinguished. The beast roared, and the world began to shatter. 3 months earlier. The world was made of green and damp earth. Alara's world, at least. It lived in the scent of crushed herbs under her mortar, the feel of moss under her fingertips, the taste of clean water from the stream that ran behind her cottage. She was a healer, an herbalist. She lived on the edge of the Blackwood territory, close enough to be of service to the outlying villages, but far enough from the capital and its pack politics to be left alone. Alone was safe. Alone was predictable. She was human, a stray brought into the territory as a child, and while the pack did not harm her, they did not embrace her. She was useful, like a good hunting hound or a sturdy axe, They came to her with their sick pups, their gashed arms, their birthing fevers. She would mend them with roots and leaves, and they would leave a haunch of venison or a sack of flour on her step before retreating back to the warmth of their own kind. She never felt the lack of it more than in the evenings, when the silence of her small home would press in, thick and heavy as a winter cloak. She would sit by her hearth, the flames dancing, and imagine the great hall in the capital, filled with the sounds of a family, a pack, a people bound together. A warmth that had nothing to do with fire. Today, she was searching for sunglow moss, a rare lichen that only grew on the underside of granite shelves in the deepest parts of the forest. It was said to soothe the most agitated spirit, to calm the rages that sometimes took hold of the wolves. She didn't have a patient who needed it, but she gathered it when she could. The forest was her apothecary, and she kept it well stocked. She had ventured further than usual, following a vein of granite that led her up a steep, unfamiliar ridge. The air was thinner here, the trees older, their branches twisted into shapes like grasping hands. A sense of being watched prickled her skin. This was the king's wood. Not just his territory, but his personal hunting ground. It was said his beast was wilder here, that he came to this place to let it run. A shiver of fear, cold and sharp, traced its way down her spine. The tales of the Alpha King were told in hushed whispers around village fires. King Theron, the beast of the north. A ruler of immense power who had held the throne for 2 centuries, unmated, unchallenged, and utterly ruthless. They said his heart was as cold as the mountain peaks that ringed his kingdom. A sudden crack of rock above her made her freeze. She looked up. The granite shelf she was under groaned, a low, deep sound of protest. A web of fractures spread from a central point, dirt and pebbles raining down around her. She didn't have time to run. The world became a roar of sound and a crushing weight of darkness and pain. Pain was the first thing to return. A dull, throbbing agony in her leg, sharp and biting in her head. Then came the cold, a damp chill that seeped into her bones. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were heavy as stones. She was lying on wet leaves, pinned. A slab of granite, thick as a man's chest, lay across her left leg. Panic, cold and slick, rose in her throat. She pushed against the rock, her hand slipping on the wet surface. It didn't move. It wouldn't move. She was trapped. A twig snapped nearby. Her heart leaped into her throat, hammering against her ribs. A rogue wolf? A bear? She held her breath, trying to make herself smaller, to melt into the forest floor. A shadow fell over her. It was huge, blotting out the dappled sunlight that filtered through the canopy. She forced her eyes open, blinking against the pain and the sudden brightness. He stood over her, a giant carved from mountain stone and winter shadow. It was him. The king. He was larger than the stories described, broader in the shoulder, radiating an aura of power so immense it felt like a physical pressure in the air. His hair was the black of a raven's wing, long and unbound, streaked with a surprising shock of silver at the temples. His face was harsh, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, a face made for command and war. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. They were not the cold gray of the mountain stone she expected. They were gold. Molten, luminous gold, like the heart of a forge, and they were fixed on her with a terrifying intensity. He didn't speak. He simply looked, his gaze traveling from her face, down to the satchel of herbs spilled beside her, to the rock pinning her leg. A muscle clenched in his jaw. She expected him to be angry. She was trespassing. She was a nuisance. She expected him to turn and walk away, to leave her to her fate. Instead, he knelt. The movement was surprisingly fluid for a man so large. He placed one hand on the slab of granite, his fingers splaying across the cold, damp surface. She saw the intricate tattoos that coiled up his arm, ancient symbols of power and lineage. He didn't seem to strain. He simply applied pressure, a steady, inexorable force. The rock, which had felt like a piece of the mountain itself, lifted. It tilted, groaned, and then he shoved it aside with a dull thud that shook the ground. Ilara cried out, a sharp intake of breath as the pressure vanished, leaving a fiery, sickening agony in its place. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. The sight of it made the world swim. The king's golden eyes narrowed. He looked at her leg, then back at her face. He was assessing her, his expression unreadable. She thought she saw a flicker of something in their depths. Not pity, but something else. Something like recognition. It made no sense. He had never seen her before. Without a word, he reached for her. His hands were huge, calloused, but his touch was shockingly gentle as he slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. Her head fell against his chest. Through the thick leather of his tunic, she could feel a strange, profound cold. Not the damp chill of the forest floor, but a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from his very core. It was unnatural, wrong, and beneath the scent of pine, winter air, and leather, there was another scent. Faint, but sharp. The scent of sickness, of something slowly, inexorably, decaying. The ruthless Alpha King, the immortal ruler, was dying. The thought was so absurd, so impossible, that she dismissed it as a delusion brought on by pain and shock. He started walking, his strides long and steady, carrying her away from the place of her ruin. The forest floor tilted and swayed with his movements. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the pain, the fear, the impossible reality of being held in the arms of the beast of the north. His wolf, the creature of legend, was supposed to be a monster of rage and violence. But as he carried her, she felt a strange stillness from him, a quiet that seemed at odds with every story she had ever heard. The beast within the man was calm. It was the last coherent thought she had before the darkness claimed her completely. She woke to the scent of beeswax and clean linen. The mattress beneath her was soft, the blankets heavy and warm. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth nearby, casting flickering shadows on a high, vaulted ceiling. She was in a bed, a real bed, in a room larger than her entire cottage. Panic flared. She sat up, a gasp of pain escaping her as her leg protested. It was splinted, tightly and expertly wrapped. She looked down and saw that she was wearing a simple linen nightdress, not her own dirt and blood-stained clothes. Someone had tended to her. The heavy oak door creaked open. A young woman with the sharp features and amber eyes of the wolfkin entered, carrying a tray. She stopped short when she saw Ilara was awake. "You're awake," the woman said, her voice neutral. "The king will be pleased." Where am I?" Ilara's own voice was a dry whisper. "The King's Keep. In the capital," the servant replied, setting the tray on a bedside table. It held a bowl of steaming broth, a cup of water, and a small ceramic pot. "This is from the royal physician. For the pain." The King's Keep, the heart of the pack. She was in the beast's den. "Why am I here?" she asked, her heart starting to pound again. "Why did he?" The servant's expression was a mixture of confusion and awe. "No one knows. The king does not bring outsiders into the keep. Ever. He found you. He carried you here himself. And he commanded the physician to see to you. The entire court is whispering." She leaned a little closer. "His beast. It has been on a knife's edge for months, prone to rages. But since he brought you here, it has been quiet." The door opened again, and the servant immediately straightened, bowing her head low. King Theron filled the doorway. He had changed into a simple black tunic and breeches, his long hair tied back with a leather cord. The firelight played over the harsh planes of his face, making him seem both older and more weary than he had in the forest. He dismissed the servant with a flick of his eyes. She scurried out, closing the door softly behind her. He did not approach the bed immediately. He stood by the fire, his back to her, staring into the flames. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. The cold she had felt from him in the forest was still there, a palpable aura that seemed to drink the warmth from the room. "You are a healer," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. "I am," she managed to say. He turned his head slightly, his golden eyes catching the firelight. "My physician says your leg is broken in 2 places. It will be weeks before you can walk." Fear clenched in her stomach. Would he cast her out? "You will remain here until you are healed," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. She stared at him, bewildered. "Why? Your Majesty, I am no one. A human. I trespassed." He finally turned to face her fully. "You are not no one. You are the first thing in a very long time that has quieted the storm in my blood." His honesty was a physical shock, more jarring than the fall. The great Alpha King, admitting to a storm in his blood? To her? "I don't understand," she whispered. "Neither do I," he admitted, and for the first time she saw a crack in the stone facade. A flicker of something lost. Something deeply weary. "But I will." He walked to the bedside table and picked up the small pot the servant had brought. He uncorked it and sniffed the contents. A faint frown touched his lips. "Poppy milk. It will dull the pain, but it will cloud your mind." He set it back down, his gaze finding hers. A healer should have a clear mind. He left the room as silently as he had entered, leaving her alone with the crackling fire and 1,000 racing thoughts. He was a puzzle of contradictions, a ruthless king with a gentle touch, a being of immense power radiating a chilling sickness, a man who spoke of a storm in his blood and who believed, for some reason, that she was the calm. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. Servants brought her meals. The royal physician, a stern older wolfkin named Alistair, checked on her leg daily, his expression a mixture of professional duty and deep suspicion. But every evening, as dusk settled over the stone fortress, the king would come. He would sit in the chair by the fire, sometimes for hours. Often, they did not speak. He would simply sit, watching the flames, and she would lie in bed, watching him. The silence was not empty. It was filled with a strange, companionable weight. In his presence, the restless energy that had hummed beneath the keep's foundation seemed to settle. The guards outside her door seemed less tense. The very stones of the castle seemed to breathe easier. She was his cure, and she had no idea why. She began to notice the small things, the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his left hand, which he would still by clenching it into a fist. The way he would sometimes close his eyes, a faint sheen of sweat on his brow, as if fighting off a wave of pain, the deep, unnatural cold that never left him. One evening he brought a tray himself. It held not the bland broth she had been given, but a rich, fragrant stew and a chunk of fresh bread. "The physician's tonics are for the weak," he said, his voice flat. "You need strength to heal." As she ate, her healer's instincts took over. "You don't sleep well, do you?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. His golden eyes snapped to hers, sharp and dangerous. "What makes you say that?" She gestured with her spoon. "The dark circles under your eyes, the tension in your shoulders, and—" she hesitated. "The chill. It's the kind of cold that comes from deep within, from exhaustion that has settled into the bones." He did not deny it. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, and for a moment she feared she had gone too far. Then he gave a short, humorless laugh. I have not slept through a night in 50 years. 50 years. The casual mention of time was staggering. There are herbs, she said softly. Silver root and moon petal. They can quiet the mind without dulling the senses. They bring rest, not stupor. He watched her, a long, searching look. And you would know how to prepare them? It is my trade, Your Majesty. The next day he had a basket of herbs brought to her room, along with a mortar and pestle. She sat up in bed, her leg propped on pillows, and worked. The familiar ritual of crushing leaves, of measuring powders, of breathing in the earthy scents centered her. It was the only thing in this strange new world that felt like home. That evening, she steeped the herbs into a tea. When he arrived, she held the steaming mug out to him. He took it, his large fingers brushing against hers. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. His eyes widened slightly. She felt it too, a sudden warmth that had nothing to do with the tea. He drank it slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. He didn't question the ingredients, didn't call a taster. He simply trusted her. The weight of that trust was heavier than any mountain stone. He finished the tea and set the mug down. He rose from his chair, and for the first time, he walked to her bedside. He stood looking down at her, his shadow falling across the bed. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Ilara." "Ilara," he repeated, the word a quiet rumble. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. His touch was cold, so cold, but it sent a shiver of heat through her entire body. "Rest now," he said, and left. That night, Ilara dreamed. She dreamed of a great golden wolf, magnificent but shivering, a creeping frost clinging to its magnificent pelt. She dreamed of reaching out her hand, a soft light blooming from her palm and melting the ice away. The next morning, the entire keep was buzzing. The king had slept. He had slept through the night, dreamlessly, for the first time in half a century. And when he had woken, the guards said the killing frost that usually coated the windows of his chambers had vanished. From that day on, she was no longer just the human healer. She was the king's remedy. Their evenings changed. He began to talk. He spoke of his kingdom, of the political struggles with the southern pacts, of the weight of his long, lonely reign. He never spoke of his illness, of the cold that consumed him, but it was the ghost in the room, the unspoken context for everything. She, in turn, told him of her life, of the herbs, the forest, the quiet solitude. She spoke of her parents, whom she barely remembered, humans who had died of a fever when she was a child, leaving her to be found by a pack patrol. He listened with an unnerving stillness, his golden eyes seeming to see right through her, into the lonely corners of her heart. She was falling for him. The realization was as terrifying as it was undeniable. She was a humble healer, a human, a nobody. He was an alpha king, a near immortal being of immense power. The chasm between them was wider than any canyon, and yet, in the quiet of her room, with the firelight dancing between them, it felt as if there were no chasm at all. Only two lonely souls who had found a strange solace in each other's presence. One night, he seemed more agitated than usual. The tremor in his hand was more pronounced, the cold radiating from him more intense. He paced the room like a caged animal. "The blight," he finally bit out, the words torn from him. "That is what my people call it in whispers, an old curse on my bloodline. It rises slowly, a cold that leeches the strength, that agitates the beast. In the end, it consumes the body and shatters the soul." He stopped in front of her, his face a mask of controlled agony. "It is getting worse, faster. But when I am with you, it slows. The cold recedes." He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a desperate, hungry hope. What are you, Alara? I am a healer, she whispered, her heart aching for him. You are more than that, he growled, taking a step closer. You are my... you are... He cut himself off, turning away, his fists clenched at his sides. The battle within him was a palpable thing. The arrival of Lady Seraphina shattered their fragile peace. She swept into the keep like a winter storm, all silver blonde hair, ice blue eyes, and regal fury. She was an alpha in her own right, the daughter of a powerful allied clan. The court bowed before her, a mixture of fear and reverence in their eyes. Ilara heard the whispers. Seraphina was the one the king had been betrothed to, decades ago, before he had inexplicably broken it off. Seraphina came to Ilara's room on her second day. She did not knock. She entered, flanked by two of her own guards, her gaze sweeping over the chamber with open disdain before settling on Ilara. So, Seraphina said, her voice like the chime of breaking ice. This is the little human pet, the king's new distraction. Ilara felt small under that cold, assessing gaze. I am a healer. The king was injured and required my aid. She corrected herself. I was injured. He aided me. Seraphina laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. Oh, I have no doubt he is injured, but his sickness is not one your pathetic little weeds can cure. Her eyes narrowed. He broke our betrothal, you know. Sent me away with no explanation. For 50 years I have wondered why. Now I see. The blight has taken root. He is weakening. And in his weakness, he has turned to this sentimentality. She glided closer to the bed, her scent, sharp ozone and cold fury filling the air. Whatever hold you think you have on him, understand this. It is an illusion, a symptom of his decay. He is an alpha king. He needs an alpha queen, not a human crutch. I will cure him. I will forge a new bond with him that will burn this weakness out of his blood. And you, she leaned down, her face inches from Ilara's, will be gone. The threat was clear. Seraphina began her campaign immediately. She was a master of pack politics. She reminded the court of their old alliances, of the strength she would bring to the throne. She was always at Theron's side, discussing matters of state, joining him in the training yards. She subtly undermined Ilara at every turn, referring to her as the human patient, questioning the efficacy of her folk remedies. Theron grew more distant. The visits to Ilara's room became shorter, more strained. The weight of his duties, combined with Seraphina's constant presence, was pulling him away. The cold was returning to his eyes, the storm gathering in his blood once more. Ilara's leg had healed enough for her to walk with a crutch. She felt like a prisoner, confined to her rooms while the woman who wanted her gone slowly took over the king's life. The breaking point came with the pup. Kale was a young orphan, barely more than a toddler, whose parents had died in a border skirmish. He was a quiet, solemn child with big, curious eyes. Theron had a soft spot for him, often letting the boy sit at the foot of the dais while he held court. One afternoon, Kale fell ill, violently ill. He was seized by convulsions, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The royal physician was summoned, and his face went grim. It's poison, Alistair declared, his voice shaking with rage. Nightshade and wolfsbane, cleverly mixed to mimic a fever. Seraphina was there, her face a perfect mask of concern. How could this happen? Who would do such a thing? Alistair's eyes, full of his long-held suspicion, turned to Ilara. The ingredients. They are common in a healer's satchel. And the pup? He was seen near the human's chambers this morning. It was a lie, a perfectly crafted, venomous lie. Ilara had been in her room all day, but her satchel of herbs, which she had requested to replenish her supplies, had been brought to her that morning. Anyone could have taken something from it. Theron arrived, his face like a thundercloud. He looked from the convulsing pup to Alara, and she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. A moment of hesitation that broke her heart. "I didn't do it," she said, her voice trembling. "Theron, you know I wouldn't." "She is a human, an outsider," Seraphina said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Perhaps she doesn't understand our ways. Perhaps it was an accident. A misplaced poultice." "It was no accident," Alistair snarled. The court erupted in whispers. Fear and suspicion turned on her like a pack of wolves. She was the outsider. The strange human who had somehow bewitched their king. It was easy to believe the worst of her. Theron looked at the frightened faces of his court, at the dying pup, at the accusing glare of his physician, at the triumphant sorrow in Seraphina's eyes. He was trapped. His kingdom was on a knife's edge, his own beast raging against the blight. To defend her now would be seen as madness, the final proof of his weakness. It would shatter his authority. He met Alara's gaze, and the agony in his golden eyes was a thing she would never forget. It was the look of a man choosing to sever his own limb to save his life. "Take her," he commanded the guards, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Escort her to the border. She is banished. If she ever sets foot in Blackwood territory again, she is to be killed on sight." Each word was a physical blow. The guards seized her arms. She didn't struggle. She just stared at him, her heart splintering into 1,000 pieces. He had chosen his kingdom over her. He had not believed her. As they dragged her away, she saw him turn his back, a great solitary figure colder and more alone than ever before. Seraphina laid a comforting hand on his arm, a look of pure victory on her face. The beast had won. The great hall was a cavern of ice. The memory of her exile slammed into Alara as she burst back into the throne room, the king's decree of death upon her head. The cold was a living thing, a manifestation of the pain she had seen in him, now unleashed and uncontrolled. She pushed past the guard who had tried to stop her, his warning lost in the roar of the king's agony. She saw it all in a flash. Elder Maeve's prophecy of doom, Valerius's grim despair, the terror of the court, and Seraphina, standing near the throne, her face alight with a horrifying, ecstatic triumph. This was what she wanted. Not to rule beside him, but to watch him be destroyed by the thing she could not have. Alara fell to her knees beside Theron. His skin was so cold it burned. The rime of frost on his hair was spreading, encasing him. He was being frozen from the inside out. "What kind?" he had asked. What kind of omen? Not an omen of the end, an omen of a choice. She had felt it, miles away in her lonely exile, a snap in the fabric of the world, a cry of such profound agony that it had no sound, but she had felt it in her very soul. It was him. The fragile connection they had forged, a thing she hadn't even had a name for, had screamed with his pain, and she had run. She had run back towards the death sentence, towards the heart of the storm. "You cannot save him, little weed," Seraphina hissed, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The blight has won. His beast will shatter his mind, and I will be there to pick up the pieces of his kingdom." "He is not a kingdom," Alara whispered, her hand hovering over his chest. "He is a man." She thought of the quiet evenings, of the trust in his eyes when he drank her tea, of the gentle way he had brushed the hair from her face, of the loneliness in him that had called to the loneliness in her. It wasn't weakness. It was the only real thing in this entire stone fortress. Love. The word bloomed in her heart, fierce and painful and bright. She would not let him die. She ignored the gasps of the court. She ignored Seraphina's venomous glare. She saw only his face, etched with a pain too great for any being to bear alone. Leaning down, she pressed her lips to his. They were cold as ice, lifeless. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperation. A final, silent goodbye, an apology for not being enough. She poured all of her sorrow, all of her hopeless love into that single, fleeting touch. "I love you," she whispered against his frozen mouth, and the world exploded in light. It was not fire, it was not lightning, it was life. A wave of pure, golden warmth erupted from the point of their contact. It was the light from her dream, but 1,000 times brighter, 1,000 times more powerful. It surged from her, through her, a dormant river bursting its banks. The ice covering Theron's body didn't melt, it sublimated, turning to mist and vanishing in an instant. The violent, clawing frost that coated the hall evaporated, the stone pillars warming under the golden radiance. The unnatural cold that had plagued the keep for months, for years, was annihilated. The light poured into him, a torrent of pure vitality. She felt the blight, the ancient curse, shrivel under its touch. It was a thing of shadow and decay, and it could not exist in this unrelenting dawn. She felt his heart, which had been stuttering, beat strong and steady. She felt the breath, which had been a shallow rasp, fill his lungs. The beast within him, which had been roaring in agony, went silent. Not a silence of death, but of peace. A deep, profound stillness, as if it were finally, after centuries of struggle, at rest. The golden light pulsed outward, washing over the entire hall. It brushed past the royal physician, and Alistair gasped as he looked over at the small cot where the poisoned pup, Kale, had been lying, fading. The boy's convulsions ceased. Color returned to his cheeks. His eyes fluttered open, clear and bright. The poison was gone, neutralized by a power that cherished life above all else. Seraphina screamed, shielding her eyes. The light was anathema to her, to the cold ambition and hatred that filled her heart. It did not harm her, but it exposed her, stripping away her mask of concern and revealing the twisted jealousy beneath. Everyone saw it. Everyone understood. The light receded, drawing back into Alara, leaving the hall stunned and silent. She knelt, trembling and drained, beside Theron. His eyes opened. The ice was gone. The shadows were gone. They were pure, molten gold, clear and bright and filled with a love so fierce it made her ache. He reached up, his hand no longer cold, no longer trembling, and cupped her cheek. His touch was warm, so wonderfully warm. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. Valerius and the guards stared, their spears lowered, their faces filled with utter awe. Elder Maeve was on her knees, her head bowed, not in fear, but in reverence. She had seen an omen of the end, but she had been wrong. It was the omen of a new beginning. Theron pushed himself up, his movements strong and sure. He did not look at his court. He did not look at the exposed villainess who now trembled in the corner. He had eyes only for the woman who had knelt in the heart of his storm and called him back from the abyss. He rose to his feet and drew her up with him. He stood before his throne, his people, and held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "She is no outsider," he declared, his voice ringing with the absolute power of an alpha king, but softened with a love that transformed it entirely. "She is the heart of this pack. She is the life that answers the blight. She is my mate, my queen." He looked down at her, and the smile that touched his lips was the first genuine smile she had ever seen on his face. It was like watching the sun rise after a century of winter. "You asked what I was," she whispered, her voice choked with tears of relief. "I know what you are," he said softly, his thumb stroking her cheek. "You are mine." He lowered his head and kissed her again. This time, there was no desperation, no ice, only warmth and promise, and the breathtaking certainty of coming home. 3 months later, the great hall was filled with warmth and laughter. Sunlight streamed through the high arched windows, illuminating tapestries that were no longer grim depictions of battle, but vibrant scenes of forests and fields. The unnatural chill was a distant memory, banished by the life that now flowed from the throne. Queen Alara sat beside her king, her hand resting in his. Her simple healer's dress had been replaced by a gown of deep forest green, but she still wore a small leather pouch of herbs at her belt. She was a queen, but she would always be a healer. It was not a trade she practiced, but the very essence of who she was. Theron was a changed man. The harsh lines of his face had softened, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by a deep, steady contentment. The blight was gone, not just suppressed, but utterly eradicated from his bloodline by the force of Alara's power. A power that, they had learned, was tied to the very life force of the land itself. She did not just heal people, she healed the world around her. Seraphina had been stripped of her titles and exiled to the desolate southern islands, a fate worse than death, for a creature of her ambition. Her betrayal had been so absolute, so vile, that not even her own family would speak her name. Kale, the young pup, now sat on a cushion at Alara's feet, playing with a carved wooden wolf. He rarely left her side, his small presence a constant, joyful reminder of the day the light had returned. Theron leaned over, his lips brushing her ear. The delegation from the Silver Creek Pack is growing restless. They wish to discuss the trade treaty. Alara smiled. Let them wait a little longer. They are not used to seeing a king who holds his queen's hand during court. He chuckled, a low, warm sound that sent a pleasant shiver through her. He lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles. Let them get used to it. They will be seeing it for the next few centuries. The heavy doors of the hall opened, and Lord Commander Valerius strode in, a grin on his face. He approached the dais and bowed. "Your Majesties," he said, his voice booming with good cheer. "Elder Maeve sends a message. She has read the signs, the flight of the eagles, the blooming of the winter roses in the palace garden." Theron raised an eyebrow. "And what omen does she read today, Valerius?" Valerius's grin widened. "A most powerful one, my king. An omen of prosperity, of a long, warm summer, and of a new life coming to the heart of the pack." His gaze flickered meaningfully to Alara's stomach. A stunned, joyful silence fell over the hall. Theron's golden eyes widened, then locked with hers. He didn't need an elder's prophecy to know the truth. He could see it in her eyes, in the radiant glow that always surrounded her, now shining brighter than ever before. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He placed a hand on her belly, his touch reverent. He felt it then, not a kick, but a faint warm pulse of the new life they had created. A life free from curses and shadows. He rested his forehead against hers, the business of the kingdom, the waiting delegations, all of it fading into insignificance. All that mattered was the woman in his arms, the life they had made, and the endless sunlit future stretching out before them. The beast's behavior had been an omen after all. It had been an omen of the queen who was coming to save them all.